The Everlasting Gaze Azure Amulet is one of the more underrated unique amulets in Path of Exile 2, especially for classes that invest heavily into increasing their maximum mana. The more mana a player has, the better the Everlasting Gaze becomes. Despite these benefits, this amulet is surprisingly easy to obtain, thanks to its relatively high drop rate and availability in the marketplace. Here is how to get it. In Path of Exile 2, there are 3 ways to get the Everlasting Gaze Azure Amulet. They are: random drop from regular monsters, by using an Orb of Chance on a white Azure Amulet, by trading with other players. The Everlasting Gaze Amulet has the possibility of dropping from level 39 plus enemies, indicated by its base item level. This means it only enters the possible pool of drops starting from Act 3 in the campaign. The only way players can influence the drop rate of the Everlasting Gaze and other uniques is by stacking rarity of items found on their gear and farming as many mobs as possible. The Orb of Chance can be used on a normal, white, Azure Amulet to gamble on the chance of obtaining the Everlasting Gaze Amulet. To do so, simply right-click on an Orb of Chance and left-click on the Azure Amulet. If it works, your item will be transformed into the Everlasting Gaze. If it fails, your item will either be destroyed or turned into something else. There are 2 possible uniques an Azure Amulet can turn into. Ungil's Harmony is virtually worthless and can be found for as little as 1 Regal Orb on the trade site. While valuable, the Everlasting Gaze Amulet is not the best choice to use an Orb of Chance on if you have options like Sapphire Ring, Dream Fragments, or Stellar Amulet, Astramentus, available. The most reliable way to obtain the Everlasting Gaze Amulet in PoE 2 is through the official trade site. The going price for this item varies wildly depending on how good the rolls on 2 of its variable stats are, as well as how its corruption turns out. The reason the Everlasting Gaze Amulet is coveted is mainly because of one of its stats: gain 20 to 30% of maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield. For mana heavy builds like Spark Sorceress or Infernalist, this is a no-brainer because it directly converts 20 to 30% of their mana into energy shield, the best defensive stat in the entire game. The only things standing between incoming damage and a player's life are evasion, armor, and energy shield. Among them, ES is the most reliable because it has none of the downsides of the other 2. The Everlasting Gaze Azure Amulet's ability to increase this all-important stat by a huge amount is why it works so well in almost all builds, but especially ones that invest heavily into mana. Additionally, the Everlasting Gaze also gives a plus 70 to 100% mana regeneration rate thanks to the combination of its implicit and suffix, making mana recovery vastly easier. Do keep in mind, however, that while this amulet is great for the campaign, early endgame, and even some pinnacle bosses, it is not BIS for most builds. This is because it is entirely defensive, with no utility other than mana regen and no offensive stats. Ideally, an amulet should also provide flat stats, rarity of items found, spirit, and resistance if you're not capped. Everlasting Gaze provides none of these. That said, if the rest of your gear covers these requirements for your endgame build, the Everlasting Gaze will be a nice cherry on top.